Well, I think that was our entire message on the Monday show before the draft was, look, there's not a lot of strategies that are bad here. If they trade out all the way out of the first round versus sticking exactly in the 7 spots and taking them, there's all kinds of different strategies. They could have deployed everything in between, and the roster needs so many pieces that I think, and a lot of the players we really liked. I mean, we talked about Jarvis Brownlee a lot in the build up to this draft, and so for them to go get him, we touched on Cedric Gray a bunch, but not as much, and so we'll get to him in a second. Here's how I would sort of describe it, and I think I said this on the Monday show and the prediction show on Thursday before the first round, which is this team has to focus on its front seven and the offensive line. Like they did the receiving thing in the free agency. They did the cornerback thing in free agency. I wanted to see a lot of people, a lot of big beef in the middle. I wanted to see offensive and defensive linemen, front seven players, and they did a lot of that. They got 2 off-ball linebackers, they got an edge, they got a defensive tackle, and they got a starting left tackle. So now we can get into debating the specifics of the tactics, which is different than the strategy. But from a strategy standpoint, I can even argue that I think going to get Cedric Gray at 106 and then telling us immediately afterward that he's going to wear the green dot and play alongside Kenneth Murray as a starter, to me, that tells me that even ties back into their free agency strategy. Now, it may be terrible, he may be bad, and he may not work out. But what it tells me is that they had a vision and a plan. They went out and executed it. They wanted tackle in the first round. They were looking at defensive line or maybe some flexibility with their second pick. We can debate what questions we have about Sweat or risk or not risk, but like, I know you love the pick. And so the point is I wanted a defensive lineman or a front seven player with that pick. They did that. I can't get upset when they do the thing that I think that they should do. And then they addressed starting middle linebacker. They addressed another corner that we all loved. They got another edge rusher that is a bonus pick. Again, when you start talking 6th and 7th rounders, they're just sort of house money at that point. But they need a bona fide star edge player next year in the offseason. They probably need another offensive lineman maybe in the offseason. But by and large, they sort of addressed all the needs. Safety is still potentially something they could do.
They have like 15 or 16 offensive linemen, including these UDFAs. It's a high number of offensive linemen that they have. It feels like it's the most offensive linemen I've seen heading into like training camp on this roster.
And honestly, what I like about the strategy is that they all help each other. And again, we'll get into the specifics of the player, but T'Vondre Sweat, if he is the player they deem him to be at 38, then that's going to help Kenneth Murray and Cedric Gray and Jeffrey Simmons and the edge players. If J.C. Latham is the player that they deem to worthy of being taken at 7 overall, that helps NPF on the right, that helps Cushenberry, that helps Skoronski, it helps Will Levis. So like the ripple effect of all of these decisions, I think, I can't argue with the strategy. We can discuss the tactics, but I don't think we can argue with the strategy. The only part of the strategy that I think fans are, I think it's okay to ask the question, because I think Brian Callahan, the way kind of Mike Vrabel had to come out last year about Tajay Spears and be like, well, if the best night of his life was getting drafted, then we took the wrong player. And that
wasn't Spears specific. That was just overall draft specific.
No, but that wasn't like Rand Carthon's intent, but like he kind of said that, and then Vrabel kind of helped out. And I think that kind of happened here with Sweat as well, where Brian Callahan was kind of coming out and sort of like backing up the pick with some information. The trade back thing, I think people are focused on that. If he is the player that they think is going to be a starting defensive lineman in the NFL next to Simmons for the next 8 years, then the trade conversation is completely irrelevant. The question is, I think the more interesting question is, could you have gotten him later? And with all the stuff that's sort of swirling around him, you still paid a premium for him. And I think that's ultimately the only real question is like, well, could you have gotten him for cheaper or a little bit later and added something? Maybe, but maybe not. Who knows? You have to get your guy eventually.
Yeah. So do we want to just dive into the trade topic, I guess?
And we can kind of get it out of the way if you want. So
well, it's not an easy topic to discuss. It's a very complicated topic, right? Because the NFL draft is not built in absolutes. So let's start with what we know. We know they had several trade offers. We know that there were several second-round trades after them. Maybe even there were a couple, I think, before them. But we know that Atlanta traded up ahead of the Tennessee Titans to get Rook Nukem. So We know that another team valued a defensive tackle. Okay. The risk that happens with the trade back, and I think there's two things at play, right? So there's this national media narrative that this was a reach. So because he was ranked so low on big boards after the DWI, automatically means that he could have been available later. We know that the NFL, unless it hits a critical event, unless it is a critically dangerous event, does not really care about DWIs, does not really care about smoking weed. It does not really care about anything unless something major happens. Whether you agree with that or not, that's an entirely different discussion. Like whether you agree that that is a good process and that's how it should be handled.
I don't think anyone should give a shit about people smoking weed. No. I don't
Right.
think
Well, I'm
anyone
just
should ever
saying
care.
in general, you're going in a totally different direction that doesn't really matter. So, we have to understand that the NFL does not view a DWI as much as Dane Brugler viewed it. Heading in to this before this event happened, the DWI, he was 33rd on Dane Brugler's big board, the 33rd overall prospect. After the DWI, he dropped around to 129. Unless time travel happened and someone went and changed the tape, that is the deciding factor of what moved him down that far. Does that mean that he maybe wouldn't have moved down to 38 if he viewed another player? No. I mean, maybe he moved down a couple of spots. If you look at the consensus draft board run, he was hovering around 40.6. So that was his average from March to the end of, or from February to the end of March. He hovered around 40.6 was his overall big board ranking. After the event, leading into the draft, it went from 40.6 to the average of 69.8. So I think we can all agree that if there is a pivotal point to examine, it's that happened. Like that is what moved him down boards, not the tape. Not like I said, most of these guys had him in the top 50, really in the top 42. So not the tape. So you are getting a second round player at a second round price. Here's the thing. The NFL views him as a second round player. We saw after Jazon Newton went off the board, here comes the Atlanta Falcons to get Rook. After the Tennessee Titans and apparently the Rams, it's been reported, were trying all day to move up to get Braden Fisk. But if you trade with the Rams, you move back. Brandon. But if you move back too far, which that would have put them behind Cincinnati, behind Jacksonville if they would have made that trade. Yes, you get a future second round pick. And trust me, I love second round picks. But you have to say in that room, if we move behind this far, so if you took the Rams trade, how many players do we have on the same level as Sweat?
Yeah.
Because I believe it was 52 is what the Rams moved up from. So if you are at 52 and you're moving from 38 to 52, you have to have a lot of players at the same grade as Sweat. That is so unlikely, right? Because they were so convicted in it. If you look at the other trades with the Saints gave up a 150 and 160 or 150 and 190 to move up. That's not good. That's not good value. What do you need those picks for? A 6th and a 7th or a 5th and a 6th, whatever that may be. That's not really good value. The Eagles traded up to get Cooper DeJean, right? Well, they traded 50 and 53 and a 5th round pick, but they got back the Packers 2nd, the Packers 3rd, and a 180 pick. Well, you don't have a 3rd, so you're not getting that good of a deal, right? You don't have a 3rd to give up, so the Titans don't. So they're not going to get that deal. They're going to get a lesser deal. So it sounds like, for all intent and purposes, is that the Rams panic traded after Sweat went off the board because they saw Newton. They saw Rook get traded up for, and then they saw the Tennessee Titans take Sweat, and it sounds like a panic trade.
Yeah.
Now, we just have to understand that the likelihood of the Tennessee Titans having that many players the same grade as Sweat is so highly unlikely at the spot they would have gone. And if he's their guy, you draft your guy. We say
Yep.
that about
Yep.
every player. Draft your guy.
So quickly, just so that people know, Fisk, defensive lineman, not the same type of player as Sweat, but a defensive lineman goes very next pick. The next three people traded. So the Packers at 41 move back to 45. They still draft probably the player they would have taken at 41, Edgerrin Cooper.
Right.
But that's, again, a guy that probably, to your point, does not have a lot of other peers in the evaluation process around that range, because the very next, I think, off-ball middle linebacker that's drafted, I believe, is Colson down at like 69.
What's your focus? What you got to focus on if you're the listener or the watcher is that it's Cincinnati and Jacksonville, right? You can't move past them. If you move behind them,
yeah,
because they took defensive linemen. And let me tell you something: Cincinnati
so did Cleveland
would have taken Tavondre Sweat. I am 1,000% convinced. And then you have Cleveland. If you moved back even further, you look at Cleveland. What if Cleveland wanted to try to trade up and got desperate because Sweat started to fall?
Yep.
So what if, they wanted to move up because they got Michael Hall? And Sweat and the Bengals double dipped at defensive tackle.
So Mason Smith at 48, Chris Jenkins at 49, Michael Hall at 54. So we know for sure, for a fact, that all three of those teams would have been looking at Sweat no more than 10 or 12 picks later. So if we're talking about a trade, we're talking about a 10 slot window at the best. So you're not going to get a ton in return. Now, I will disagree with a lot of the commenters here about like what Rand Carthon says on a radio show or at a press conference when he says, no. They absolutely, we knew teams wanted to come up and draft him. That may be true. It may not be true. It's irrelevant. I'm not taking anything he says because they can't. There's nothing else you can say other than we needed this. We wanted this guy. We're going to draft our guy. So I don't actually care what he has to say in an interview about any of the stuff. We just don't know. Like, oh, of course Rand Carthon's going to go on the radio and be like, yeah, another GM told me they really wanted him. Like that helps sell his argument. So that's irrelevant to me.
He worded it. Let me just say this, just in defense of this, he worded it a lot differently than what you're talking about. It's worded with a lot more detail, and he didn't have to say it. He wasn't asked really. It was towards the end of a long conversation about other stuff and he didn't have to say it. So I do think that the team they heard from that he's referencing is 100% the Cincinnati Bengals.
So ultimately, you kind of address sort of like the media focus on Tavondre Sweat. We can look at the actual facts of the draft that took place and know that there wasn't a huge offer, no matter what, on the table that is baked into risk to moving back and maybe missing out on him. It is also fair to consider the risk of taking him at 38. And it's okay to ask a couple of questions, which is, I don't care. Like, I do care about, driving under the influence, especially with kids that have opportunities to take, that kind of stuff. I think but ultimately, to your point, I agree. The NFL doesn't. What I do care about is decision-making. And the decision-making process in this month-long, 2-month-long, 3-month-long job interview to make the mistake. Okay, it's fair to ask the question. Doesn't mean he's going to be a bad player or a bad guy, but it's fair to ask the question, just like the weight. Fair to ask the question. And I think, and I'm going to take this from Koharski because I don't think he meant to say it like this, but I took it to mean a certain thing. He said he's a big man who has big man problems and he needs to have big man solutions. And I think of that as adult, like that third big man is being an adult. Like you're a big man. That's who you are. And you're going to carry with you big man problems, which is you're going to have to focus and work hard on your weight. But what it requires is an adult, a grown-ass man to make big man adult decisions about your career and your life. And the Titans, feel like comfortable that he's going to make those decisions. And so, again,
they did a good job of vetting it, right? This isn't the Isaiah Wilson situation where John Robinson's on record of saying, well, we didn't really do a really good job of vetting. They done a good job of vetting him. I mean, they went down to his,
they went down to
house,
Austin, right? Yeah.
Talk to his family and set expectations not only with him but with the family. And right there, to me, what that signals to me is that after they had their visit with him, they heard enough, and they wanted Sweat. After he came to Nashville after the DWI, they heard enough. And then they were like, it's time to make sure that he knows um how serious he's going to have to take this.
Yeah.
We are going to go ahead and set down expectations. And we are going to tell him why these expectations are placed. And then we're going to inform his family of what their part can be in this as well. Because a lot of times, what people don't understand is that the support system these rookies come in with is just as important. The established support systems that they've had prior to coming in that come with them when they head into the pros is just as important. I'm sure Lindell White would be one of the ones to tell you that he wishes he probably had a better support system,
Oh,
and
Vince.
a lot of those friends didn't end up being friends.
Yeah, I mean, Vince.
So I think, yeah. So I think that going down there and everybody having man-to-man, face-to-face conversations multiple times is such a different process, and should tell you that with the conviction that they have, that he was obviously not only their guy,
Yep.
but he was also their best player available. And I think that's where I think there's this thing that they're drafting for need. We know that is not what they do. We know that they play the board. And I think that just because they have so many needs, that almost any position that they could have drafted is going to look like a position of need.
Right.
But this is the bet. They're drafting the best players on their board, and they just happen to be, because of how the draft fell and how the board was set up, the positions of need. Of course,
Well,
they have like 50 of them.
And I was going to say, I could argue edge pass rusher is a bigger need than a true defensive tackle that can sit up next to Jeff Simmons. And I think they do. Titan Maximum said they better put some weight clauses in Sweat's contract. I think there are actually. They're going to
that's the general assumption that people have made based off of it could be expensive to be overweight.
Yeah.
That could mean that, if you stay overweight, you're not going to get a second contract. And it could mean fines as well.
That's true.
They may have fine provision. But let me say this. He's already down to 366. And the plan is to get him to only 355 to 350, according to his words. It doesn't seem like they've really set down an exact threshold because they're waiting for Zach Woodfin and him to come in. But even if they are, they're only asking him to drop at a minimum of 11 pounds. And that shouldn't be, with practices here and all that kind of stuff, and the weather and all that kind of stuff, it shouldn't really be that hard.
All right. Well, again, want to say special thanks to Sickers Beverages and Kingston Group for us having Zach, guys, I wish you could have all seen Zach the moments before the pick on Friday night. Not only was it a great night for the kids and for our sponsors and for food and for all the listeners, but just fun to watch Zach just lose his shit when they picked T'Vondre Sweat, with how right he was, of course. Look, I love the strategy. I think addressing the front line is what I said on I want two big bodies to help the defensive and offensive lines, and that's what they did. So I can't argue with the strategy. And right now, J.C. Latham, and this is what we can start. Let's get this out of the way with the starting two, because I do think Sweat actually helps in a big way Cedric Gray, the fourth round pick. Like having Sweat next to Simmons and those two guys clogging up a lot of space is going to help Gray and Kenneth Murray in a big, big way from a movement standpoint. So ultimately, I think there's a lot of people saying like, oh, they didn't address maybe Latham's a right tackle. And, you and I have talked a lot about the right tackle, left tackle thing, his journey, his career path. We've talked a lot about, if you get one great tackle, that's good enough. You still haven't solved the left tackle. He is the starting left tackle right now on this team. Mm-hmm. And if you put down the list of offensive linemen on the roster, because you mentioned there's like 14 of them, the top three offensive linemen right now on this roster are Lloyd Cushenberry, Peter Skoronski, and J.C. Latham. Not in any order, but just those are the three.
Yeah.
One of them's a free agent, wasn't on the team. One of them's a rookie, and one of them's a rookie last year. That is overhaul on the offensive line. So clearly that they're doing that to try to help the rest of the offense. T'Vondre Sweat is a starter right now next to Jeffrey Simmons.
No doubt.
We will see what the management looks like for his weight. We will see if he can play on 3 downs for his entire career, for a short period, for all of it. Who knows? But he's a starter right now, which brings us to pick 106. And Cedric Gray, to me, the one thing I keep thinking of when I analyze this pick and I look at this pick and the name was announced, was that this was their guy all along. We can agree or disagree on whether or not he is, But to me, this felt like they had circled and targeted Cedric Gray at 106 the entire process, maybe even going back into free agency. That they really like
What
this
makes
guy.
you think that? I'm
So,
just curious. I'm not
so,
disagreeing or anything.
so I'm gonna. Some of this is just sort of trying to put some red string together here on the wall. Yeah. But if you come out in a press conference after drafting a 4th-round linebacker and say he is going to wear the green dot, that you think you're pretty confident in what you've drafted. You feel pretty highly about a player, and I think we all knew that he would probably be available around that slot, if not. Again, if you look at the line
earlier, I didn't think he would be there, to be honest with you. With the state of the linebackers, I really thought he'd be in round 3.
And that's totally possible. But if you see why they didn't, they went and got Murray as sort of like a number 2, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's, to me, you put Sweat in front of him. Like, it all kind of looks like it was the plan. And if that's the case, I give them major kudos and major Rand Carthon and company and Brinker and everybody. I give them all credit for executing their plan. I don't know if it's the right plan or if it's going to work. I don't know if Cedric Gray's he reminds me of Jayon, like a bigger version of Jayon Brown, very athletic. He was a basketball player and an offensive player up until college. 360 tackles, 37 games started the last 3 years. Like, this guy can play. There's also scouting reports that are like, well, he gets kind of washed up in traffic a little bit. He's a little small. Like, he's got to work on his hand placement. He's a rookie. But to say in the press conference that he's going to wear the green dot tells me that he was pretty high on your plan, pretty high up on the list of things that you planned for. And I think, to me, that's what I like about them. They feel convicted. It feels convicted that they're going to go get this guy.
Every pick to me feels convicted, which is something that I don't think that you could say about every other draft pick that they've ever made in recent history, dating back to at least John Robinson. You could say it never felt like there was a more of a draft class that was like, every pick, even Jaquan, every pick makes sense, but they were convicted about every pick. And something about getting your guy, and trade ups, going back to a little bit of the trade discussion. This shows that I don't know who is running the board or who is running the strategy of this draft, but the way that they just kind of sat there, even though that it did make it a 7-hour show when they could just trade it up a couple 7s for 1 and get us out there earlier.
No, they have to pick like the 5th to last pick in the draft.
But it felt like they had a good feel for what the teams ahead of them were going to do. They had a really good feel for what was going to happen. And kudos to whoever in that room, if it's a collaborative effort or if it's the chief strategy officer, which is Bryce Wasserman, who just recently got promoted. Kudos to whoever it was, because I was thoroughly impressed with the overall strategy of being able to sit there and have the confidence that you loved your board good enough and you had a very, very good idea of what was going to happen ahead of you, that you did not panic, that you did not do anything crazy. And you knew that guys like Jarvis Brownlee, who I know they fell in love with, we know that Tyke Tolbert spent a lot of time with Jaquan Jackson at his pro day, so they obviously liked him there too. Yep. Jalen Harrell makes a lot of sense. Like, to me, it feels like they had a really good job. And I guess Team Ramrod says he thinks they credited Sarah Bailey for knowing when the positions run were coming. Good for her. I think that's tremendous. I think it shows a really good side of analytics, in my opinion. And they were just so confident in their process. Yeah. And I think the process will yield good results. Time will tell. But I even if they yield bad results, I will say this was a good process. It was good process, bad result. Is how I would label it.
And I agree. And again, to make sure we all understand, and I think people do, there's a difference between they love their board, they played the draft well, they had their guys, they felt confident in what they were going to be able to execute, and they went out and did it. That is not the same thing as saying the board is accurate, or Cedric Gray is a star, or Javondre Sweat will be a starter, or Jarvis Brownlee. That's not the same thing. They're different things. But yeah. I think it's hard to argue with their approach and their strategy and what they went out and executed.